Welcome to the Hyperion Hub, your meeting place for all things Disney. Now your hosts.
Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Hyperion Hub, your meeting place for all things Disney. We are in downtown Peoria, Illinois, the home of the beautiful Peoria Riverfront Museum, and we have a special guest today. Jeff Sherman is joining us, this time in person. We talked with you about a year ago. Thanks for joining us, first of all.
Oh, my pleasure.
And you were in town to show The Boys, the Sherman Brothers story, a fabulous documentary about your dad and your uncle, the Walt Disney music duo, and they worked for other companies as well. And it's one of the best Disney documentaries I've ever seen.
I'm sorry. I had to.
Well, this concludes our episode.
Thanks for having me.
For folks who haven't seen the film, why don't you give us a synopsis of the movie?
Well, my father and uncle, as you mentioned, were principally Walt's in-house songwriters from 1960 till he died in 1966. I'm asking, you guys would know better than I would. And then continued writing for them afterward. They weren't guys that publicized themselves. They weren't like, you know, Burt Bacharach or Marvin Hamlish, and you know those names. They weren't really household names. They just liked to work and contribute to things. And my dad and my uncle were getting a little bit older. And I got together with my cousin, who I didn't know very well, which if you see The Boys, the Sherman Brothers story, you understand why we didn't really. But we got together and we wanted to pay tribute to them and connect them to their legacy of 1,000 published songs and 50 movie soundtracks and all that stuff, because they weren't self-publicists. They didn't like to do it. And I also wanted to do it because for myself, my dad, I never really thought, even though he did all this stuff, I never thought he really connected with the contribution that he made and the legacy that he left. So I wanted in his lifetime for him to see the movie and see all of it together. So that's why Greg and I got together, and my cousin Greg and I got together and made the movie.
So let's dive into your dad and uncle. They were very different outside of the studio, but they made incredible music together. Talk about the dynamic relationship they had.
Well, they were 2.5 years apart. My dad's the older brother, but they were always from little kids. They were very different types. My dad was kind of quiet and shy, Robert. And he was a poet, and he was an artist, and he had all these different kind of things, but he was sort of an internal guy. My uncle was hyperactive, and self-admittedly, he'll tell you, and he was always seeking attention and wanting to get in there, but my dad was kind of the golden boy, the older son a little bit, so he was a little jealous of him. And as they progressed through their career, they worked together for their entire careers, basically, as adults. Those kind of differences kind of cemented themselves. And while it didn't make for a great interpersonal relationship, the fact that they were two very different guys, as we show in the movie, really contributed to what made these songs. It caused sort of a friction, a kind of a chemistry that allowed them to create things that probably nobody else could create. They had a familiarity as brothers, but they were very polarized personalities.
So Poppins was, of course, the first big, hit for the Boys, but they had been working for Disney for several years before that. Talk about how that Disney connection was made, and I think Annette had something to do with that.
Yeah, well, they had written a song that was recorded by one of the Mouseketeers named Judy Harriet, I think, and it was called Tall Paul. And they had written this song because all the songs were being written about boys singing about girls, different types. And they said, let's write one of a girl singing for a boy. It's picked up by Judy Harriet. She records it. And at the same time, Annette Funicello was the Mouseketeer that was getting all the letters. She was the big popular Mouseketeer for various reasons. But she was kind of, if you ever watched the show, she kind of stood out a little bit. And so Walt really loved her and wanted to have her have a recording career outside the Mouseketeer show. So the first song he chose was Tall Paul. So it became this thing, and then my dad and uncle were brought in, and they started writing pretty much all the Annette hits. They wrote, 17 or something songs for Annette. They wrote Pineapple Princess and a bunch of these.
That was for the Hawaiianette album?
Well, the great thing was they were so versatile, they could write in any style, and so the Annette albums were Hawaiianette, Dance-Annette, Italian
Italianate.
all of them. They said when she was going to have babies, it would be bassinet, and so they could write in any kind of a song. And so Disney saw these two guys who he kind of didn't know that well, and Annette was going to do a movie called The Horse Masters, a TV movie for the Sunday night movie show that he did. And so he had them in. So they came in with a song called Strummin's Song that they sold, and it was their first song for a Disney movie. But Disney had them into the office. They didn't know they were going to meet with him. They were just, Jimmy Johnson, who was the head of the music department there, said, come on in, and they drove to the studio. They didn't park on the lot because they didn't have any money to pay. They thought they had to pay for parking on the lot, and they parked on the street and walked in. And Jimmy goes, "Come on, Walt's waiting." And so they went, and they meeting with Walt Disney, who is enormous. It's like meeting the Wizard of Oz. And they walk in, and he starts pitching on the movie that he wants him to write songs for, and it's not The Horse Masters. He goes, it's these two girls, they're at summer camp, they've never met before, but they're sisters, they're twin sisters, and they're looking at each other like, we didn't write anything for this. And so my dad, and they were told not to call him Mr. Disney, he liked being called Walt, and so my dad goes, Mr. Disney, and he goes, Walt. And he goes, okay. He goes, we wrote for The Horse Masters. He goes, okay, play that song and that'll work. Okay. He goes, but here I want something written for these two girls. And so they ended up getting that assignment. But they were depressed because they thought, that'll work. That song was, they liked the song. And who's this Disney guy think he is, right? Jimmy Johnson goes, guys, you just got a song placed in a Disney movie and he gave you an assignment for a second one. Nobody gets that. So they realized and they came around, and that was sort of the bridge. Annette came to, got them into Disney, and then he hired them as the only staff songwriters he ever had.
That'll work, I think, was about the best compliment you could get out of Walt.
That meant he was going to put all of his resources behind it. But he was on to the next thing. He was just very kind of that way.
Well, let's talk about resources. So, a wonderful tribute. How do you approach your cousin and the Disney company? I mean, the idea is there. What's the next step?
We had been asked to meet with this woman who supposedly had $100 million in Chinese funds to make movies, and she wanted to do a scripted movie about the Sherman brothers. And by the way, if you ever find out somebody offers you $100 million from China, they're not telling you the truth. But Greg and I, who had not known each other, which was also discussed in the movie a bit, we got together for the first time to talk about our dads with this woman, and we found out we were finishing each other's sentences. We had that kind of same thing going on, and she goes, you guys are brothers? And it's, no, we don't even really know each other. So we lived 7 blocks apart, but we didn't know each other socially. And so that fell apart because there was no $100 million apparently. We decided we would figure out a way to do a scripted biopic of our dad. So that's what we wanted to do, actors coming in and doing it. And to present it, I took Greg out for his birthday lunch at a little deli near our house in Studio City. And I said, Mary Poppins, the stage musical, is opening on Broadway. It had been in England, but it was opening on Broadway. I said, to sell this idea of our dads, because they weren't really connected to their songs. People said, they didn't know this was a Sherman Brothers song necessarily, so it was hard to sell that project. I said, let's tie them in with our songs. Why don't we get one crew at Mary Poppins at the opening to follow your dad, and another crew to follow my dad, and because they hadn't seen each other at that point in like 5 years. And I said, we'll both go to the theater and see what happens, and we'll start shooting this. And then that grew into shooting some of the people that were there, like Roy Disney and Cameron McIntosh, and just the various people that were there. Tom Schumacher's the head of Disney Theatrical. And we did about 10 interviews, and with our dads. We did one together with them, and my dad, as always, just shut down because my uncle talks over him. So then we did them individually, and those are the ones we used. And we got this thing, and we put it together. We cut together a 25-minute presentation. We gave it to Tom Schumacher and to Roy Disney, and they both called Dick Cook, who was the chairman of the film department then. And I got a call at home from Dick Cook. They said, can you hold for Dick Cook? I said, yes. And he goes, I hear you got something special I got to see. Can you come in tomorrow with your cousin, and I want to see it. And it's 25 minutes goes by. At the end, he's like wiping tears. It was pretty emotional. And he goes, okay guys, come in tomorrow and we're going to have a meeting with all the department heads. You're going to do this, we're going to start it as a documentary, and then we'll make a deal with you for a scripted biopic too. So suddenly I'm a documentary filmmaker as things go. And Greg and I just jumped into it, and we ended up doing 88 interviews around the world, and we did, we have 160 of their songs in it, and our grandfather's songs, because he was also a composer. It was about a 3.5-year process.
So working with your cousin, people think, oh, that'd be fun, but you didn't know your cousin. You had this huge shared family history. How was it working with him, getting to know him, how your relationship developed through the course and since?
Well, a tough thing to do. Well, the way I actually met my cousin, I knew him. We'd go to screenings, I'd see him, hey, how you doing, Greg? But I never sat down, never had lunch with him, never, just because our families were very separate. So at the opening of Chitty in England, I flew out for like a day to London to see the opening of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang at the theater there and spend the time with my dad, and then I flew back. But that night after the show, they had a big party at this club called the In and Out Club, and it was tons of people. And I there with my dad, and he went to bed, and so I'm just looking around this party, and I see Greg sitting at the bar doing Jello shots. I remember that. and I walked up to him, and I sat down. I said, "So, what happened with our families? What do you know?" He went, "I'm so glad you came over here," and we talked all night. And then, so then it was tough though, because a tough thing to do is you go, I don't really know you that well. I've never made anything with you. We haven't really produced together. We know the same story from slightly different angles, but let's talk about our family dysfunction, which is going to be a problem. I mean, it's tough. So there were parts of times, and I sat down. I think I told you, Sean. I said to Greg at the very beginning of it, I could see that it could be wrought with a lot of contention. So I said, look, the way we're going to approach this is nobody's a bad guy. Our dads are different. Nobody was wrong. It's not about that. It's about the magic of, to me, the soul of this piece was always, it's not unusual for siblings to fight, right? And it's not, especially when they're in business together and in that close proximity, but to be able to do that for 50 years and do all these things together and create this body of work is really the really cool thing about my dad and uncle. So we got through it. There were times that were tough. Every now and then our editor would turn around from the screen and go, what I'm looking at right here with you two guys is much more interesting than what I'm cutting. We go, no, that's not right, because we would argue through how we're going to do it, and he had his things with, his mother wanted certain things a certain way, Greg's mom, and my mom was gone at that point, but I knew my dad wanted certain things, so we were kind of defending those aspects. So occasionally got that way, but Greg and I are in business together now. We've stayed really close, and we've just moved on from it. So
That's fabulous. Talk about, I'm very close to my first cousins, and you've built this relationship with your cousin that you didn't have when you were children. One of the things about cousins is you have these deep roots, and you didn't have that growing up. Have you been able to kind of fill family gaps, learn history, things like that? What's your relationship like today with him besides business?
Well, I think probably some of my siblings and cousins would disagree with this, but I always had a really close relationship with my uncle. I mostly knew him I'd ride my bike after school and go to their office, and they'd play me whatever they'd just written. So I'd hear my uncle just sort of play that, and once in a while my dad would look up and he'd sing a chorus with him and then go back to writing. But having not known my cousin, it's interesting because he is very different from me, but a lot of ways we're very similar, and we share, the same grandfather and the same, our families were so dysfunctional that my grandfather on Saturdays would come down to our house, and he'd take me out flying kites, which is where Let's Go Fly a Kite comes from. He was the big kite guy, or fishing down on the Santa Monica Pier. And then after he was done with us, he'd drive over to Dick's house, which was 7 blocks from our house, and he'd take those kids out and do it. But we seldom did it all together. Once in a while, when it was really contentious between my dad and my uncle, my grandfather would say, everybody's coming to the park, and he'd have us all go fly a kite. That happened a couple times. Kind of I think that's why the family comes together at the end of that movie. Mm-hmm. So, it's really special to me because it really expanded a side of, like on my mother's side of the family, I'm very close to all those cousins, but I really didn't know this side at all. And we've gotten super close. I mean, we've been around the world together and it's kind of like being in the army together when you make a movie. You know, there's a lot of battles you fight together. He impressed me. He had the skill set I didn't have. I had the skill set he didn't have. So it really worked out well.
Jeff, thank you so much. The movie, like I said, it's one of my all-time favorite, not just Disney documentaries, but documentaries.
Thank you.
And I love the approach you all took on it, and it's so great to hear the background on it. So thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you weren't able to join us here at the Peoria Riverfront Museum, make sure you watch the film on Disney+. If you can purchase the DVD, there's tons of great special features on it.
Then you double check that camera.
Should we wrap?
Yeah, I love it.
It's your show.
It's not my show, it's our show.
Yeah. No wonder you're the favorite.
How long have you guys been doing the show?
2
We
years.
started in we first met fall of 19 and got
And then
going
something
in
happened.
January of 20.
Yeah,
and
something
then,
happened about that point.
And then COVID happened, and so we never saw each other again for a year and a half except on Zoom.
Our kids are in music and theater together, and our kids are in sports together.
Oh, my kids are in music.
And music.
Anyway,
But
we've
that's
known each
where
other
we
for
knew.
30 years.
That's where we met. So 30. It feels like
That's cool.
It's been fun. It's been a real
We
joy.
moved to Washington. Clara was in 8th grade, and she said, "Dad, there's a kid here who knows who Oswald the Rabbit is."
my son. Yeah.
And it was his son. And then there was a field trip that, that they needed chaperones.
Oh, yeah.
Clara said, "Evan's dad's going." I'm like, "Oh, I'll go on that field trip." And forget the field trip. We talked for 3 hours on a bus up
fun.
to Chicago.
And when I knew you were serious was when you mentioned the name Sherman, because you had worked with his uncle.
With Richard, yeah.
Levi.
Yeah. That was, the fact that you worked with them, I'm like, wait a minute, what?
Yeah,
All right.
you can't just wedge that in.